In this video, we are going to take a look at different kinds of callback function that we have been using throughout the journey of learning about JavaScript. So here we have 4 examples. The first example is about addEventListener. Example 2 is about fetching data. Third is array.map. And fourth is setTimeout. We'll look at all 4 of them to understand the common pattern when we use callback function. So here when you look at this example, here we are trying to say whenever an event of type click happens on the document or the web page, you have to call this function in future, right? That is what you want. Because user is going to click on document in future. So whenever an event of type click happens, you have to call this function, and that's why this function is a callback function. We are not the one who is calling them. It's addEventListener or any higher order function is what is going to call this function that we are passing. So if you try to take a look at it, as soon as you execute this code, this part of the code where you're calling document.addEventListener is going to be called in present, but this part, the function reference part, is going to be called in future. So this code is going to run in future. So this is our present code and this is our future code. Let's move on to the next example. So with this program, what we are trying to say, go ahead, open this URL and I need to get data from this URL. So whenever the data load is done, you have to call this function in future. And that is what we are doing here. This line is going to be called in present. The same thing is going to happen with open. So these 2 lines are going to be called in present, but the function that we are adding to onload is going to be called in future whenever the data is loaded properly. So this is going to be the code that is going to run in present, but this part is going to run in future when the data is loaded. So whenever we needed some kind of action to be taken in future when data is loaded, we are providing it as callback. So now if we move on to example 3, you can see that you have an array here. And what you're saying is, I want this function to be called on each element of this array. So this callback function will be called multiple times. Who decides that? So it's the function map that is going to decide how many times you have to call this callback function. So again, this function is also going to be called in future. So here also we'll see that the line where you are defining array and calling map is going to be called in present, but the part where we are sending a callback function, this callback function is going to be executed in future. Moving on to last example. Here, what we are saying with this code is after 2000 millisecond, you have to call this function. So setTimeout is going to be called in present, but this callback function will be called in future. So based on this condition, what we can understand is whenever we need some kind of action to be taken in future based on certain condition, the condition of time, the condition of number of times you have to call that, or the condition of whether data is loaded or not, or the condition of whether user is going to click on something or not. So whenever you need some kind of action to be taken in future, we generally use this callback pattern at different places in JavaScript. One thing that we understood here is we use callback whenever we need certain action to be taken in future. So this is how you should make your mental model about callback function. Whenever somebody says that you have to send a callback, it means that the function that you're sending is going to be called by some function that is coming from web browser API or it is coming from JavaScript API. Here in the case, it is web browser API. Here, it is again going to be a web browser API. In future, there will be a lot of cases where we will be using some third-party library, something like Jest, Lodash, and many others. And the function coming from those library will be asking you to send a callback function. And the reason even they are asking you to do that is because when to call the function or how many times you have to call that function depends on certain situation, and that will be decided in future. So in simple terms, whenever you want certain action to be taken in future, we use callback pattern. In our next video, we are going to look at what are the limitations that there is when it comes to asynchronous code and callback pattern.